I remember the exact moment it started, though I'll never forget the way my chest tightened, as if it were trying to squeeze the fear out of me before my brain could even register it. The house felt wrong. Not in the obvious, something is broken way, but in the subtle, uncanny way that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. The ticking of the clock, the faint hum of the fridge, even the air itself. It all felt heavy, charged, like it was waiting for something I didn't understand. I had been alone in this house 1,000 times, but this night was different. I didn't know why, and that was the worst part. That ignorance, the lack of explanation, made the fear worse. It started with a noise. A tiny, almost imperceptible shuffle from the living room, like the brush of a sock against the carpet. My heart stuttered, a pause that lasted too long before I remembered I was alone. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Shadows, maybe, or the house settling. But the words felt hollow even as I spoke them aloud. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by anyone human, not yet, but by something waiting, lurking, measuring me in some way I didn't understand. I moved slowly, carefully, my bare feet sliding across the cold hardwood. Every creak of the floorboards beneath me sounded like an alarm. I froze mid-step, listening to my own breath, to the faint thrum of my pulse in my ears. I had never realized how loud fear could sound until that moment. It wasn't a quiet, distant tremor. It was all-consuming. A wave of panic that flooded my senses and made every shadow in the room seem alive. The living room was dark, but the moonlight poured through the window in sharp, cold streaks, cutting across the floor. I could see the furniture, the outlines of chairs and the sofa, but the shadows between them seemed thicker than they should have been, like black liquid pooling and waiting for me to move. My hands shook, my fingers brushing against the edge of the coffee table, as if it were a lifeline. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It's just shadows. Just the night, I whispered. The words fell flat. They didn't convince me, and I knew they wouldn't. I tried to calm myself by moving toward the kitchen, reasoning that I would feel safer with a knife in my hand, something tangible, something I could use if what? I couldn't even finish the thought. If the fear wasn't rational, it didn't need to be. It simply existed, wrapping itself around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. And then I heard it again. That noise. So slight, so fleeting I thought I imagined it at first, but this time, I knew I hadn't. A soft, almost tentative shuffle, like a shoe dragging across the carpet. My heart pounded. My stomach twisted. Every instinct in me screamed to run, to hide, to do anything but move forward. But something else held me there. An inexplicable need to understand what was happening, to face it even if I didn't know what it was. I tiptoed back toward the living room, each step a battle against the primal urge to flee. The shadows seemed to stretch, reaching toward me in slow, deliberate movements that made no sense but felt terrifyingly real. Then I saw it. Or rather, I thought I did. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. Too fast for me to focus on, gone before I could turn my head. I stopped completely, holding my breath, forcing myself to listen to anything that would tell me I wasn't imagining it. The room was silent again. Dead silent. Except for the faint, almost imperceptible hum of the night outside. But that wasn't enough. My mind was racing, creating shapes, faces, threats from the shadows, each one more horrifying than the last. I sank to the floor, pressing my back against the couch, trying to make myself small, trying to make myself invisible. My knees were drawn up to my chest, my arms wrapped around them, and I stared into the darkness, every nerve screaming. I was terrified, not because I knew what was coming, but because I didn't. That was the cruelest part, the fear of the unknown, the suffocating awareness that something might be there, and I couldn't see it. Minutes passed like hours. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to the silence. The fear didn't go away, it only grew, creeping along my skin, burrowing into my chest, pressing against my ribs like a heavy hand. I couldn't call anyone. The phone was in the other room. Even if I could reach it, what would I say? There's a shadow in my living room. It sounded absurd, and yet, the absurdity didn't make the fear any less real. My mind started replaying every story I had ever heard about children who saw things that weren't there, about quiet, muted warnings that no one understood until it was too late. The air felt thick, almost tangible, and I began to imagine shapes, figures, shadows that weren't there, but that my fear insisted existed. I could almost see them at the edges of my vision, creeping, shifting, waiting. And then I realized the fear wasn't just about what was in the room. It was about what I was carrying inside me. Every secret, every hidden thought, every lie I had buried. It was all pressing down, waiting to be seen, to be exposed. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to shut it out, but it didn't help. The fear was inside me now, not just in the room, not just in the shadows. My heart raced, my head spun, and I felt like I was going to collapse. I whispered to myself, over and over, trying to anchor myself to reality. It's okay. It's okay. I'm okay. The words were meaningless. They didn't touch the panic in my chest. And then I heard it, a soft, unmistakable sound, closer this time, deliberate, measured. A small footstep. A shuffle. My breath caught in my throat. I dared not move, dared not look. My eyes were wide, straining to make out shapes in the darkness, to see the source of the sound. And then I realized I wasn't imagining it. Something, or someone, was there. And I was completely, utterly alone. The fear became sharper, more acute. Not the vague, creeping anxiety of the empty house, but a visceral, clawing terror. I could feel it in my bones, in my skin, in the very rhythm of my heartbeat. It was almost physical, like the air itself had turned to ice and was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to call out, to do anything to break the spell. But my voice refused to work. I was trapped in the quiet fear, paralyzed, waiting for the unknown to reveal itself. Hours, or maybe seconds, I couldn't tell, passed. I don't know how long I sat there, unable to move, unable to think, caught in the purest form of fear I had ever experienced. Every noise was magnified, every shadow a threat. My body was trembling, my hands were cold. My stomach was in knots. I thought I might never breathe freely again, and yet in that terror, I began to notice something else. A small rhythm, a pulse in the darkness. A hint that I wasn't completely alone, a spark of life in the middle of the fear, waiting to reach me. That spark was her. Even before I realized it, I knew it. The shadow, the sound, the shuffle, they belonged to her. My sister's daughter. The child everyone assumed was mute, unreachable, untouchable in her silence. And yet, there she was, moving closer, inch by inch, breaking the wall of quiet fear that had surrounded me like a cage. I didn't know if I could handle it. My heart was still racing, my hands still shaking, but there was something familiar in her presence, something that made the fear jagged, but also bearable, something that told me I wasn't completely alone in the house, in the dark, in the world. And in that moment, as she approached, I understood the first truth of the night. Quiet fear isn't just the absence of danger. It's the waiting, the uncertainty, the unknown. It's the awareness that you are fragile, exposed, and vulnerable, and that anything could happen. And it is also the moment just before everything changes. After that first night, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted to myself before. I was alone in ways I'd never allowed myself to truly feel. Not just in the house, not just in the dark, but in life itself. Fear had been the first crack in the walls I'd built around me, but isolation was the mortar that had held them together for years. And now, Sitting there in the shadows, I understood it fully for the first time. It wasn't a dramatic loneliness at first, not the kind that screams and demands attention. It was quieter, more insidious. A creeping emptiness that made the house feel larger than it should. Every room echoing back my own thoughts, my own doubts. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing down on my shoulders, bending me towards something I didn't want to face. I realized I had spent so much of my life pretending the absence of people around me meant safety, that solitude was a choice, when in truth, it had been imposed. I had been cut off, not just physically, but emotionally, from anyone who could have understood me, anyone who could have reached me. I started noticing the little things. How the walls seemed to close in when I was alone, how the corners of rooms became darker, more secretive, as if they were keeping something from me. Even the furniture, the familiar couch, the worn rug, everything I had touched and moved 1,000 times, it all felt foreign now. Every shadow carried the weight of what had never been said, what had never been shared. And the more I noticed, the more isolated I felt. Like I was watching the world from behind a pane of glass, able to see, but never to be touched, never to be part of it. During the day, I would move through the rooms, the hum of the refrigerator, and the distant cars outside doing little to break the quiet. I found myself talking to objects, to walls, whispering words I'd never say to a person. I told myself stories about my own life, just to fill the emptiness, rehearsing conversations that would never happen, imagining explanations for why no one had been there to notice me, to hear me, to reach me. It was exhausting, this constant simulation of human connection. It felt absurd, but I had no choice. I had to survive the silence somehow. And then there were the nights. The nights were worse, always worse. Darkness stretched across the walls, turning familiar shapes into monsters. I could hear every creak of the house, every whisper of wind outside. My mind would replay the moments from the day, it turning ordinary interactions into evidence of some cosmic judgment that I couldn't escape. I would lie awake, listening to the house breathe, feeling the heavy, invisible weight of my solitude pressing into my chest. Sometimes I would cry silently, not even knowing why, because tears were safer than speaking, safer than admitting that I was aching for something I couldn't name. The isolation didn't just make me lonely, it made me hyper-aware. I started noticing the tiniest details of my surroundings, a photo on a shelf slightly askew, the faint scratch on the wooden floor where I'd tripped months ago, the way the light shifted in the living room as the sun fell. Every little thing seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't interpret, clues that I was meant to understand, meant to respond to. But I didn't know how. And in the quiet, I began listening to myself in ways I hadn't before. My own thoughts, unfiltered, unexamined for years, became loud, almost deafening in their presence. I began to recognize patterns in my own behavior that I had never faced, the way I flinched at sudden movements, the way I avoided mirrors, the way I held my breath when someone passed behind me. Even when I knew no one was there, I had been surviving in isolation for so long that I didn't realize how it had reshaped me, how it had created invisible chains that kept me bound, small, unseen. Every sound, every movement, every shadow became a test of endurance. And I realized, painfully, that I had been failing the test for years. There were moments, rare and fleeting, where I felt the urge to reach out, to call someone, anyone. But the thought of being ignored, misunderstood, or dismissed stopped me before I could even lift the phone. I had been conditioned to believe that my voice didn't matter, that my presence didn't matter, and in that belief, isolation became not just a circumstance, but a state of mind. I was alone because I had been forced to be, but also because I had learned that no one would come, no one would see me, no one would fight for me. In that silence, my imagination became both companion and tormentor. I would replay moments from my past, conversations with my sister, with her daughter, if with people who had barely noticed me. I would imagine what they might be thinking, what they might say if they knew the truth about the fear I carried, the terror I had kept hidden. I felt like a ghost, walking among the living, present yet invisible. And yet, in that invisibility, I began to notice things I hadn't before. The patterns of movement in the house, the subtle gestures of the little girl, the weight of every sound, every shift in light. Isolation sharpened my senses in ways I hadn't understood until that moment. I started to see the cracks in the facades of the people around me, even if they weren't there physically. I could feel when someone was upset before they spoke, when attention was hiding behind a smile. And strangely, in that awareness, there was a seed of connection buried deep beneath the isolation. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but it existed. I could sense the pulse of life in others, even from a distance. And that pulse became something I clung to in the darkness, a reminder that maybe I wasn't completely disconnected, even if it felt that way. But still, the isolation was relentless. I began noticing the emptiness of the rooms, the way dust collected on shelves that had once been vibrant with life, the way my own reflection in the window seemed like a stranger staring back at me. I felt invisible in ways that terrified me, not because I was afraid of being seen, but because I was afraid of never being seen at all. And every day, every night, that fear deepened until it became a part of me, an unshakable companion that followed me from room to room, whispering that I was alone, that I had always been alone, that I always would be. It was during one of those nights, it's sitting on the edge of the bed with the moonlight spilling across the floor, that I first understood the true weight of isolation. Not the absence of people, but the absence of understanding, the absence of someone who could see into the cracks of your soul and not look away. I realized that I had spent my whole life hiding, not from the world, but from myself, and that isolation had been both my punishment and my protector. It had kept me small, yes, but it had also kept me alive. And then I heard it. The softest shuffle of a foot on the carpet, almost imperceptible, like a secret breaking through the silence. My heart jumped, and in that instant, I remembered that I was not entirely alone. The presence of her, my sister's daughter, the girl who had been silent for years, cut through the isolation like sunlight through a storm, and though fear still clawed at my chest, a small thread of hope began to wind its way through me. Perhaps isolation wasn't absolute. Perhaps there was someone who had been there all along, watching, waiting, knowing. Even then, I didn't move. I stayed rooted in place, half afraid to breathe, half desperate for connection. And slowly, inch by inch, that small, invisible barrier that had surrounded me for so long began to tremble. I wasn't just alone in the world. I was isolated in my own mind, trapped in my own fears, but the first crack had appeared. And in that crack, a tiny, fragile possibility emerged that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't entirely unreachable. The first night after I realized I wasn't entirely alone, something inside me shifted. Fear was still there, it always would be, but survival became sharper, clearer, more urgent. I couldn't allow myself to collapse under the weight of loneliness any longer. Something had changed. There was someone else in this house, someone small, fragile, but somehow impossibly brave, and I had to survive, not just for me, but for her. I started moving differently, slower, more deliberately, listening to the house in ways I never had before. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the walls, every whisper of wind through the cracks in the windows became information. I learned to measure the distance of sounds, to judge what was safe and what wasn't. My body, so used to freezing at the slightest hint of movement, began to respond in ways that weren't just panic-driven. Reflexively, I adjusted, positioning myself in the shadows, keeping her in my line of sight, tracking her tiny movements like prey, but not to hunt. No, it was the opposite. I needed to protect her, and in doing so, protect myself. I realized how much of survival was simply paying attention. The little girl had a rhythm, a routine that I could follow if I concentrated. The shuffle of her shoes across the floor, the soft sigh she made when she reached for something, the way she would pause and tilt her head, listening. Each tiny signal told me something. And in watching her, in understanding her, I found a strange kind of strength. I had to be alert because she was alert, and if she could exist in this world with so little and so much silence, then maybe I could too. Food became a battleground. I had been surviving, yes, but passively, without strategy. Now, every meal, every sip of water, every small ration became a calculation. I learned where I could find things without drawing attention to myself, without causing alarm. The smallest mistakes could have consequences I wasn't prepared for. And I realized that survival wasn't just physical. It was emotional. It was learning to regulate panic, to restrain my impulses, to move through the house quietly, deliberately, without losing my mind to fear. I began to notice the way my body reacted to the tension. My heartbeat, once erratic and frantic, began to settle into patterns, synchronizing with hers. I could feel when she was tense, when she was calm, when she was about to speak or reach for something. It was uncanny, almost symbiotic. I didn't understand how it happened, but in learning to survive, I became attuned to her in ways that were deeper than words. Her silence had trained me, had sharpened me, had prepared me for the reality that I had been running from my entire life, the truth that being alone didn't mean being powerless. Sleep was the hardest part. Every creak, every whisper in the night made my body twitch, every shadow became a potential threat. And yet, I couldn't afford to not sleep. My mind had to rest, even for brief stretches, or survival would fail. I developed a kind of system. Light patterns, sounds, even smells became signals. I learned the cadence of the house, the patterns of night and day. I counted breaths, measured seconds, memorized footsteps. Survival, I realized, wasn't heroic. It was methodical. It was relentless. It was exhausting, and it was all I had. There were moments when I felt utterly unprepared, when terror clawed at me in ways that threatened to undo all progress. Shadows seemed to shift impossibly fast. Noises that shouldn't exist filled the corners of my awareness, and I would have to stop myself from panicking. But each time, I forced myself to breathe, to slow down, to recalibrate. Every instance of control, however fleeting, became a lifeline. I learned that survival was less about brute strength or courage than it was about noticing, reacting, and enduring. And then came the moments that tested me the most. When she spoke. Not fully, not in words at first, but in sound, in breath, in a glance that held more meaning than anything I had ever heard. Each small utterance was a challenge, a test, and a reassurance. I had to survive for her because she was daring to exist, daring to break the rules that had kept her silent for so long. If I failed, if I lost control, if I let fear overtake me, I would fail her. And the thought of that was unbearable. I began moving through the house differently now, with purpose. I checked locks, I cleared pathways, I ensured that the spaces she moved through were safe. It became instinctive. My mind, so used to spinning in panic, now focused with clarity. I was no longer running from shadows. I was navigating the house, anticipating them, managing them, and in doing so, mastering myself. Survival had become a skill, and I was learning faster than I ever imagined. There were times I faltered. A sudden noise would make me start. A shadow would make me freeze. I would feel my panic spike and my breath catch in my chest. But then I would see her tiny figure, perfectly still, perfectly composed, and something inside me would anchor. Her quiet presence, her calm awareness, became my guide. I realized that survival wasn't just about me. It was about responding, protecting, and enduring together. She had been silent all these years, but in her silence, she had taught me everything I needed to know. I began noticing the patterns in my own body. The trembling hands, the rapid pulse, the tightness in my chest. They were no longer signs of helplessness, but signals. They were indicators, warning systems that told me when I needed to act, when I needed to breathe, when I needed to wait. I could read myself like a map, navigate the geography of my own panic, and emerge unscathed. It was strange, almost miraculous, to feel the fear and yet move through it with precision. Survival, I realized, was about mastery as much as endurance. And then I began experimenting, testing the limits of what I could handle. I would step closer to sounds, closer to shadows, daring the fear to touch me, to break me. Each test was a victory. Each small triumph reinforced the fragile sense of control I had built. I felt like I was learning to live again, like I was reclaiming a part of myself I thought had been lost forever. And every time I succeeded, every time I moved through the fear without collapsing, I felt a small surge of something I hadn't felt in years: power. Not the kind of power that comes from control over others, but the kind that comes from mastering yourself, from surviving when everything inside you says you cannot. By the third night, survival had taken on a rhythm, a cadence. My body, my mind, my awareness, they were all aligned. I could hear the faintest shift in the house and know what it meant. I could anticipate movement, predict behavior, navigate the space without hesitation. I was no longer merely existing. I was alive, acutely, painfully, beautifully alive. And through it all, her presence was the anchor that kept me tethered. The girl who had been silent for years had, without a word, become my guide, my teacher, and my reason to endure. The realization struck me slowly, terrifyingly, that survival isn't just about staying alive. It's about responding to the world around you, about learning to navigate the invisible currents of danger, fear, and uncertainty. It's about noticing the smallest details, reacting before panic sets in, and trusting yourself to endure when nothing makes sense. And in that truth, I found a clarity I had never known I could survive anything. Because I wasn't alone, and that understanding, bare, raw, unflinching, was the first real step toward freedom. It hit me slowly, like a wave rising just beneath the surface, until I could no longer ignore it. I realized I had been living a half-life, shrouded in shadows, afraid of the very world that was moving all around me. And now, here she was, the girl I had thought silent, untouchable, untethered from reality, reminding me, in ways I hadn't even expected, that I was still capable of feeling, of noticing, of existing beyond fear. The realization was terrifying in its clarity. I had spent years believing I was helpless, that my world was defined by what I couldn't control. And yet, sitting there in the dim light, watching her tiny frame move with a careful confidence I could only dream of, I understood the truth: helplessness had never been absolute. Fear had been real, yes, but it had not been the whole story. And in admitting that, the weight I had carried for so long shifted slightly, unevenly, but unmistakably. I began to see patterns I hadn't before. The little things she did. The tilt of her head when she listened, the slight pause before she touched something, the way her eyes scanned the room, were deliberate. She was communicating in ways that defied my understanding. And slowly, agonizingly, I realized that she had been speaking to me all along, not with words, but with presence. Her silence wasn't emptiness. It was an awareness I hadn't yet earned the right to grasp. And now, finally, I was ready. It wasn't sudden. Realization never is. It crept up on me. A creeping awareness that this child, the one everyone assumed could not reach me, could not connect, had been my guide without my consent. I felt both awe and shame in the same breath. How had I not seen it before? How had I been blind to the intelligence, the perception, the courage that existed in her every gesture? My fear had blinded me. My isolation had convinced me that I was powerless. And yet, here she was, shattering those illusions in the quietest, smallest ways imaginable. I started piecing together the moments I had dismissed as coincidence or randomness. The way a book would be slightly moved, the way a chair would be nudged closer to the wall, the way she would stare at me with an intensity I had assumed was curiosity, or even defiance. But now I knew better. She had been watching. She had been waiting. She had known I was trapped in my own mind, and she had found a way to reach me anyway. And I realized something that both thrilled and terrified me. I had been rescued without knowing it. Her voice, when it finally came, shattered everything I thought I understood about the world. Not loud, not dramatic, just soft, a single word, perfectly timed, perfectly placed. And it was enough. The word didn't just cut through the silence of the house. It cut through the silence I had been living in for years, through the isolation I had wrapped around myself like armor. Suddenly, all the fear, all the self-imposed invisibility, all the small compromises I had made to exist quietly, it was exposed, undeniable. And yet, in that exposure, I felt something I hadn't in a long time. Clarity. The clarity was dizzying. I realized that my fear had been a lens through which I had filtered every interaction, every moment, every decision. I had been interpreting the world not as it was, but as my terror had convinced me it would be. And the truth, the quiet, unrelenting truth, was that I had been seeing only part of the picture. That part had been enough to keep me alive, yes, but it had also kept me small, dependent on assumptions, waiting for someone else to act, to intervene, to save me. And now, in her presence, in her voice, in her awareness, I realized that salvation had been possible all along. I could see it in the way she watched me, the subtle intelligence in her eyes. She wasn't just a child, she was a force, a quiet, deliberate, unstoppable force. And I had been blind to it, dismissive, terrified. The realization broke something open inside me, both a release and a wound. The wound was the years I had lost, the moments I had wasted, the fear I had allowed to define every corner of my existence. The release was that it didn't matter anymore. That I could finally act, finally respond, finally live. I began to notice my own behavior in a way that was both shocking and liberating. The trembling that had defined my movements, the hyper-vigilance that had ruled my nights, the hesitation that had kept me from reaching out, they all started to make sense. They were not weaknesses, they were adaptations, survival strategies honed over years of solitude and fear. And now, in the presence of her, I could recalibrate. I could take all those survival instincts and turn them into something powerful, something proactive. It's something that finally allowed me to step out of the shadows I had hidden in for so long. I thought about the moments I had missed, the signals I had ignored, the subtle interventions she had made that I had never noticed. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that she had been protecting me all along, even before she spoke. Every small movement, every silent gesture, had been a lifeline I hadn't understood until now. My realization was not just about her abilities. It was about my own blindness, my own fear, my own need to finally see. And then came the moment I could no longer deny it. I had been saved without knowing it. My life had been on the edge, teetering, and she, this child who had never spoken, who had always existed in silence, had held it steady. She had understood my fear, navigated my isolation, and guided me toward survival. The depth of that realization was overwhelming. I felt tears sting my eyes, not just for gratitude, but for the years I had lost, the time I had wasted, the fear that had consumed me. It was a revelation that reshaped everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. I wasn't powerless. I wasn't invisible. I wasn't alone. And yet, the full weight of it also terrified me. I had been living in fear, yes, but fear had been predictable. It had rules. This realization, this sudden awareness of connection, of guidance, of intervention, was chaotic in a way I had never encountered. It demanded action. It demanded attention. It demanded that I step into a life I had long believed was closed to me. I began noticing the subtle ways she influenced the house, the rhythm of the rooms, the tiny interventions that made movement safer, life more navigable. I understood for the first time how her awareness had been a shield, how her silence had been a strategy, how her presence had been a lifeline. And I realized that to survive fully, to truly step into life again, I had to respond. I had to acknowledge her, trust her, let her guide me. The realization was painful, yes, but also liberating. I felt my chest expand with a breath I hadn't known I could take. I could see the threads of fear, isolation, and survival converging into something I had never imagined possible: clarity. Not clarity of answers, not clarity of outcomes, but clarity of awareness. I knew what had been happening, I knew what I had ignored, and I knew what I had to do next. And in that awareness, I began to understand the magnitude of what had been given to me. Not just a chance to survive the night, not just a hand to hold in a moment of fear, but a lifeline that stretched across years of silence, across shadows and isolation, across all the small betrayals I had suffered at the hands of my own assumptions. I realized that she, the girl I had thought silent, invisible, untouchable, had saved me without ever saying a word. And now, finally, I could hear her. It was the first moment I truly believed that life could be different. That I could step beyond the fear. That I could survive, not just endure. And in that realization, I understood something I had never admitted. I was not alone. I had never truly been alone. She had been there all along. And now, finally, I could see it. This completes key point 4: the realization, fully expanded in fun, Zhaozen words, focusing on the narrator's awakening, understanding of the girl's presence, and the emotional and psychological shift that sets the stage for exposure and consequences. It started slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. I realized that the walls I had built around myself, the secrets I had clung to, were no longer enough. The quiet fear, the isolation, even the strategies that had kept me alive, they couldn't hide me anymore. Exposure didn't come as a shout or a crash, it came as a whisper, a truth creeping into every corner of my world. And it terrified me. I could feel it in my chest, a weight that pressed down unevenly, sharp and insistent. Every thought I had tried to bury, every fear I had shoved aside, every part of me I thought invisible. It was all coming forward. And the girl, my sister's daughter, was at the center of it, a silent witness to the unraveling of my carefully constructed life. She didn't need to speak to expose me. Her eyes, her gestures, her presence. It was enough. Every look she gave me seemed to say, I know. And the truth was, she did. I realized how fragile my control had been. All the ways I had moved through the house, all the careful plans I had made to survive, all the small victories I had clung to, they were no longer shields. Exposure doesn't ask permission. It doesn't care about survival tactics or strategies. It simply arrives, slow and inevitable, and forces you to face the reality you have avoided. And I was facing mine, brick by brick, shadow by shadow. In the dim light of a house that had once felt safe, only because I had convinced myself it was. The first moment I truly understood it came when she said something, just one word, soft, tentative, and yet so piercing that I felt it echo through every nerve in my body. That word, impossible in its simplicity, shattered the barrier I had built between myself and the world. I realized that exposure isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a whisper. Sometimes it's a single sound that forces you to confront everything you have been hiding. And in that moment, I understood my life, my secrets, my fear. It had all been seen. I began noticing the ways in which I had been monitored, observed, and understood without my knowledge. Every move I had made, every hesitation, every sign of weakness she had witnessed. And now, that observation was no longer private, it was shared. I felt the vulnerability like a physical weight, a pressing, unrelenting pressure in my chest. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was the realization that my isolation had been a lie. I had never been truly alone, and now, the truth of that presence demanded acknowledgement. The days that followed were a delicate balance between terror and awe. I moved differently, constantly aware that I was visible in ways I had never been before. The simplest action, a step, a glance, even a breath, felt exposed. And yet, in that exposure, I began to see myself clearly, for the first time in years. Every secret I had clung to, every story I had told myself to survive, was laid bare. It was humiliating, it was terrifying, and it was liberating. She didn't speak often. That wasn't necessary. Exposure isn't about dialogue, it's about presence. Every time I turned a corner, every time I moved across a room, I felt her awareness, sharp and unyielding, like a spotlight illuminating every hidden corner of my existence. And I realized that exposure has a rhythm. It doesn't just force you to confront the obvious. It forces you to confront the subtle, the overlooked, the parts of yourself you have spent years ignoring. I began to notice how my body responded to being seen. The trembling that had been survival instinct became something else entirely, an awareness of vulnerability that I could no longer deny. My mind, so used to filtering everything through fear, began to process a new reality that being exposed wasn't necessarily a threat. It was truth. And truth, though raw and painful, has a way of demanding action, of forcing clarity in ways that fear and isolation cannot. And then the moment came when I could no longer hide even the smallest detail. A slip of paper, a misplaced object, a memory I had thought safely locked away. It all revealed itself under the weight of exposure. The girl watched, silently, with an understanding I couldn't yet articulate. And I understood that exposure doesn't always come from external sources. Sometimes, it comes from within. Sometimes, the act of being seen forces you to see yourself, in ways that are uncomfortable, shocking, and unavoidable. I began to realize the implications of that exposure. Every action I had taken to protect myself, every secret I had maintained, every lie I had whispered to the world, it was all visible. Not just to her, but to myself. Exposure forces honesty, forces confrontation with reality, and I could feel it radiating through the house, through my thoughts, through every decision I had ever made. And in that realization, fear returned, not the vague, creeping fear of isolation, but a sharp, acute terror that I could no longer control what had been unleashed. It was strange, though, how exposure also brought clarity. For the first time in years, I could see the patterns of my life, the things I had ignored, the dangers I had allowed to exist unchecked. The girl's silent observation illuminated everything, the failures, the missteps, the moments when I had chosen fear over action, passivity over engagement. And in that illumination, I understood the first real consequence of exposure: knowledge. The knowledge that I had survived in isolation, that I had endured fear, that I had adapted, but that I had also been blind. I began to change, subtly at first. My movements became more deliberate, more confident. I no longer flinched at shadows in the same way. I began to anticipate outcomes, to prepare, to respond with awareness rather than panic. Exposure had forced me out of the shadows, forced me to see the reality of my life. and in seeing it, I began to take control. Not of her, not of the house, not of the world, but of myself. The most intense moments of exposure came at night, when the house was quiet, when only the moonlight cast shapes across the floor. I could feel her watching, and in her gaze, I felt the weight of all the truths I had hidden. My chest would tighten, my pulse would spike, and I would have to remind myself to breathe, to center myself, to remember that exposure is not the same as defeat. Exposure is truth, and truth can be survived. And survive I did. Slowly, agonizingly, I began to integrate the awareness that exposure had given me. I recognized my own patterns of fear, my own strategies for isolation, and my own capacity for survival. I began to see that exposure doesn't only reveal weakness, it reveals resilience. And in that revelation, I began to reclaim parts of myself that I had thought lost forever. Courage, awareness, insight, and the ability to respond rather than merely react. It wasn't easy. It never is. Each day, each hour, each minute brought new challenges. Exposure continued, relentless, forcing me to face everything I had hidden, everything I had ignored, everything I had been too afraid to confront. And yet, with every confrontation, with every realization, I became stronger, more aware, more alive. Exposure had stripped me bare, yes, but it had also given me the most precious gift I had ever received: clarity, presence, and the knowledge that I could survive, even when the world had seemed determined to break me. By the time her voice finally came again, the first clear words she had spoken in years, I was ready. Not ready in the sense of having answers, not ready in the sense of having control, but ready in the sense of understanding who I was, what I had endured, and what I could face. Exposure had done its work. It had torn away the illusions, the facades, the comforting lies I had clung to. And in that bare, raw reality, I found something I hadn't expected: power. Power not over her, not over the house, not over the fear, but power over myself. Exposure had shown me my fragility, yes, but it had also shown me my strength. And for the first time in my life, I could see clearly, without distortion, without fear clouding every corner of my perception. Exposure had revealed me, but in revealing me, it had also given me the tools to finally live. The consequences hit harder than I ever could have imagined. I had spent so long wrapped in fear, isolation, and survival that I didn't realize what it would feel like to emerge, to be seen, to be known in ways I couldn't hide from. And yet, there it was, an avalanche of truth, subtle and overwhelming, sweeping through my life all at once. At first, it was small things, almost imperceptible. I noticed how my hands trembled less when I reached for objects. I noticed that I could walk through a room without flinching at shadows. I noticed that my own voice had returned in small whispers, words I had been too afraid to form finally finding their way out. It was astonishing and terrifying at the same time, because control is a lie I had relied on for years, and suddenly, the illusion was gone. I was exposed fully, completely, and yet alive in a way I hadn't been for so long. The little girl, my sister's daughter, was at the center of it all. Every word she spoke, every glance she gave, was a catalyst for the chain of consequences I was only beginning to understand. When she first spoke, the tremor of it, the uncertainty in her voice, it broke the final dam. I realized that her silence had not been absence but preparation, and her words were the bridge from fear to reality. And reality, I discovered, has consequences. One of the first consequences was a flood of memories I had long buried. The secrets I had kept, the small betrayals I had ignored, the moments I had allowed to slip by unexamined, all returned with a clarity I had never experienced. I could feel them pressing against me, demanding recognition, demanding acknowledgement. And in that pressure, I understood that I could no longer hide from the past or pretend it didn't matter. Exposure had opened the door, and the past had walked in without asking permission. Relationships I had neglected, connections I had abandoned, all began to surface in ways I hadn't anticipated. People who had mattered, or who I had thought mattered, were suddenly visible again, their absence or presence illuminated by the light of truth I could no longer escape. I had to respond, to engage, to confront realities I had avoided for years. It was exhausting, destabilizing, and frightening, but it was real. And reality has consequences, whether you're ready for them or not. I also began to notice the physical consequences. Stress, fear, and suppression had taken a toll on my body over the years, and now, unfiltered awareness brought that toll into focus. My muscles ached in ways I hadn't allowed myself to feel. My chest felt heavier, my lungs tighter, but alongside the physical consequences was a paradoxical liberation. By acknowledging what had been buried, by facing what had been hidden, I could finally begin to heal, slowly, painfully, deliberately. Survival had brought me this far, exposure had brought me here, and now consequences were the bridge to transformation. The emotional consequences were even more intense. Guilt, shame, and regret surged through me in waves. I thought about the moments I had failed to act, the times I had let fear dictate my decisions, the words I had left unsaid. But these consequences were paired with recognition, gratitude, and even love. For myself, for the girl who had saved me, for the opportunity to finally live openly and fully. The emotional spectrum was raw and jagged, but it was real, and I realized that living fully requires experiencing it all, not just fragments of comfort or illusion. The greatest consequence, however, was the shift in power. I had spent so long believing I was powerless, trapped in a cycle of fear and isolation. But now, every choice I made, every breath I took, every step I took forward carried weight. I could no longer hide behind silence, fear, or avoidance. I had to act, to respond, to engage with the world in ways that were deliberate and conscious. And with that power came responsibility. The responsibility to protect, to honor, and to live fully in a way I had never allowed myself to do before. One night, she spoke again, a sentence this time, not just a word. And it was like a trigger. My mind raced, connecting threads I hadn't seen, recognizing patterns I had ignored. The consequences cascaded, one leading to another, until the full scope of what had been happening all these years hit me. She had been watching, understanding, guiding in ways subtle but profound, and the realization of her awareness, of her intentionality, forced me to confront my own complicity, my own inaction, my own failure to notice until now. I felt the weight of accountability settle on my shoulders, heavy but precise. Every action I had taken, or failed to take, was laid bare. And in that bareness, I discovered something remarkable. I could choose differently now. The consequences weren't just punishment, they were opportunity. The exposure of truth, the confrontation with reality, had carved a space in which I could finally decide how to act, how to live, how to move forward without fear dictating my every step. The social consequences began to emerge slowly. Family dynamics, once assumed stable or at least predictable, shifted as the truth I had carried became visible. People responded, some with shock, some with curiosity, some with disbelief, and I realized that my own perception of control had been illusory. Influence, power, and trust are fragile, and consequences ripple far beyond our immediate understanding. What I had survived alone in the shadows now had implications for everyone around me, and I had to navigate them carefully, deliberately, authentically. The psychological consequences were the most profound. For years, I had been living in a filtered world of fear and anticipation, reading shadows, imagining threats, calculating survival at every turn. And now, suddenly, that framework had shifted. I was aware of my own strength, my own resilience, my own capacity to endure and act. But with that awareness came clarity. I could no longer rely solely on instinct. I had to integrate fear, exposure, and insight into conscious action, to allow consequences to guide me rather than terrify me. And then there were moments of sheer, overwhelming gratitude. She had spoken, she had guided, she had saved me without intending to save, and I could feel the consequences of that gift coursing through every cell of my body. It was dizzying, overwhelming, almost unbearable. The fear that had defined me for so long, the isolation that had shaped my existence, the survival mechanisms I had honed, they all led to this clarity, connection, awareness, and the knowledge that I had the capacity to live fully, consciously, deliberately. The final, inescapable consequence was transformation. Exposure, realization, survival, all had built to this point. I could see clearly who I had been, who I was, and who I could become. Every choice I made carried the weight of awareness. Every action reflected the lessons of fear and endurance, and every breath was a reminder that life, in its rawest form, is not a guarantee but a responsibility. And in embracing that responsibility, I understood the ultimate consequence. I had been given a second chance, one that demanded courage, honesty, and commitment to living fully. By the time I looked at her, fully awake to the truth she had revealed, fully aware of the consequences cascading through my life, I understood something profound. Life cannot be hidden from. Fear cannot shelter you forever. Isolation can teach you strategies, but exposure teaches truths, and truths carry consequences that cannot be avoided. And the girl, my sister's daughter, had guided me through all of it. Every consequence, every revelation, every shift in my awareness was tied to her courage, her presence, her intervention. I realized finally, with a clarity so stark it took my breath away, that consequences are not punishments. They are markers. They are indicators of truth, catalysts for growth, reminders that the world, and life itself, is far bigger than fear, far more immediate than isolation, far more vivid than mere survival. And in that moment, I understood fully that I had emerged from fear, isolation, and exposure not broken, but remade, reshaped, and irrevocably alive.